Garmin released the GTN 650 series navigators to replace the now obsolete GNS 430 series. It packs all of the same capabilities as the 430, but with a bunch of extras added into it. With these extras comes added complexity though, so that's why I'm making this video. So let's dive into this complete tutorial on how to use the Garmin GTN 650 for beginners. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the 650 up on the GTN Trainer app for my iPad mini. If you don't have that, I highly recommend getting it. It is an excellent training resource to learn how to use this system, and get it and follow along with me if you want. So when you first turn on the GTN 650, you'll see that you have the database screen, so you can check that your databases are up to date. As you can see, ours are expired, which isn't an issue because this is a sim. However, if your databases are expired, you need to purchase an update from Garmin and update it per the instructions in the pilot's guide. You also have the opportunity to add your fuel on board and fuel flow if you don't have it integrated with an engine monitoring system. So we'll go ahead and configure it like the Piper Dakota that I'm used to flying, set 72 gallons of fuel and about 14 gallons an hour of fuel burn.
TOS system test OK.
So you can see that it ran the terrain awareness test, and you get an audible cue that that system is functioning properly. And then I've just got a message here that demo mode is active. So let's begin by talking about the physical controls of this unit. You can see we have two buttons and two knobs. We've got a top left and a bottom right knob. And then we have the home button and the direct to button down here. Pressing the home button will take you to the home screen. So we can be anywhere within the unit. If we want to access this main menu, just press the home button, very similar to your phone or your iPad. If at any point you want to access the default nav screen, you can push and hold the home button and it'll bring this screen up. We will dig into this screen in more detail in just a little bit. So right below the home button, you have the direct to button. So this is just the core functionality of how to use this GPS. If you're just somewhere and you want to navigate to an airport, you just push this button and select whatever identifier you want to go to. So say if we want to go to Springfield, I can select KSGF, hit enter, and hit activate, and now you can see that we are navigating to Springfield. You can also load your flight plan, and you can activate either a specific leg or the entire flight plan from here. Or you can view a list of the nearest airports from here, and if you just want to navigate to one of those, you can just press it and hit activate in a similar manner in which we did earlier. We'll talk about navigation in a little more detail here in a few minutes, but let's move on to talking about the top left knob. Pushing the top left knob can enable and disable the automatic squelch. Typically, you'll leave automatic squelching on unless you have a rough or choppy transmission coming through, then you could disable it and maybe try to decipher it a little better. And you can also turn this knob to change the comm volume independent of the intercom. So for example, if you want ATC or transmissions to come in louder or quieter and not affect your intercom volume, this is where you would do it. Moving on to the bottom right knob, it has several functionalities built into it. Pushing the bottom right knob will allow you to bounce back and forth between your comm and your nav frequencies. So you can see that we have the comm frequency active up here. And if we want to change our nav frequency, we can push it and now it says nav. To adjust your frequencies, you can use this knob and you can use the larger diameter portion of the knob that is closer to the unit to adjust the nearest whole number. So we're at Bolivar, we want to be on Unicom, so we should go to 123.0. And you can see that the large portion of the knob only modifies the number to the left of the decimal point. If we need to modify it to the right of the decimal point, we can grab the smaller part of the knob and you can see that it will adjust the frequency to the right of the decimal point. When you've dialed your correct frequency into the standby field, you can push and hold the knob to make that frequency active, and now you can transmit on 123.0. Although the bottom right knob is a good way to change frequencies and it can be kind of helpful for if you're in turbulence, there is a faster way to do it, and that's by just tapping on the standby frequency on the touchscreen, and then you can manually dial in your frequency here. So say we want to go to 119.9, hit enter, and now Springfield Tower is on standby. If we want to make that active, we can just press on the comm frequency to make the standby frequency active. You can also push and hold the bottom right knob to do the same. Now, if you have a frequency that you know you want to make active right away, so say we want to go to approach at 124.95, we can type that in and hit transfer, and it will go ahead and make that frequency that you just typed in active. The third thing to note when talking about frequencies is the monitor button. So this works really, really well for if you're trying to get your weather either from an AWOS or from an ATIS system. So we can type in 135.12, which is Springfield ATIS. And then if you hit monitor, it will allow you to listen to that frequency, but still transmit on your active comm frequency. So even though this feature doesn't work in the simulator, it does on the unit. So you could hit monitor, and now you would be talking to and listening to approach, but you would also be listening to Springfield ATIS. So this is really handy to make sure that you don't miss a transmission while listening to ATIS. The exact same functionality applies to nav frequencies as well. So you can use the knob to modify your nav frequency and push and hold to make it active, or you can press on the standby and manually enter in your frequency and hit enter or tap on the active frequency to make it active, or you can hit the transfer button to go ahead and make that entered frequency active with one last touch. Now, you are missing the monitor button on the nav frequencies because you don't typically listen to nav frequencies. So if you have transponder capability enabled with this unit, you can modify your squawk codes here. So you can see obviously it defaults to VFR, but say ATC wants us to squawk 0267. We can type that in, hit enter, and you can see that our code has been entered. Now, it says that our squawk code is on standby, and that's because the GPS senses that we are on the ground. When we take off, it will automatically switch to altitude reporting mode, or you can override that right here. As a general practice, it's best to leave standby mode on when you're on the ground because it doesn't transmit any data out, but it still receives ADS-B data in. So you can still view traffic and weather information while on the ground if you're in range of a tower. When the transponder mode is turned on, it does report your current location, but it doesn't report your altitude. And then when you switch it to altitude reporting, it reports both your altitude and current location to ATC. However, with this automatically switching modes based off of your current location and speed, you really shouldn't have to modify this. Now, if you're on flight following and you're flying into a non-towered airport and ATC tells you to change to advisory frequency and squawk VFR, you have this super handy VFR button. You can just press that, you're squawking 1200, hit enter, now you're squawking VFR. Also, if ATC asks you to ident, you can just hit the ident button right here. You can see that displayed in the bottom right corner of the transponder square, and now you're identing. So this is a super user-friendly, fast, lean interface to use the integrated transponder on the GTN 650. Let's move on to talk about the map screen on the GTN 650, which is where you'll probably spend most of your time. Zooming the map can be done in one of two ways. You can either put two fingers on the screen and pinch to change the zoom level like you would on a smartphone, or I find it easiest to just push the in and out buttons in the bottom right corner of the screen. It will also automatically zoom in and out based off of what stage of flight you're in. However, you can adjust those settings, and I'll show you where to do that. If you click and drag anywhere on the screen, you will enter panning mode. And this is where you have this cursor, and wherever this cursor is, you can view basic information about that point. So you can see your bearing to and distance from that point from your current location. From here, you can also create a user waypoint from wherever this cursor is. We'll talk about user waypoints here in just a little bit. To exit panning mode, just push the back button, and now you're back to where you were. So moving on to the map menu, you can see that we can drastically customize the map layout and all sorts of different overlays based off of exactly the data that you want to view while you're in flight. So we'll start by talking about the map overlays. The topo, or topographical setting, will shade the ground different colors based off of the elevation of the ground over mean sea level. So you can see that I live in a pretty flat area because everything's green, but if we zoom way out and look at, say, the Rocky Mountains over here, you can see that the color gets much more prominent and defined as the elevation increases. Moving on to the map overlays, we have the terrain button, which will change the color shading based off of your relative altitude to the ground or to obstacles. Although I don't typically leave this on, it could be helpful for if you're flying around mountainous or rocky areas. You can enable or disable high or low level airways from the map. I'm not an airway flyer, so I leave these off because it does make the map pretty busy. And then here in the bottom left corner, you can enable or disable NextRad. Now NextRad is available dependent on what your weather input setting is, which I'll show you where to change that here in a little bit. But essentially what it is it's just going to be radar overlays on the map based off of what I have selected as the FISB data. You're limited on the amount of information that FISB can transmit, so you can view ConUS, which will show you the weather information for the entire continent at a lower resolution, or you can view regional, which will show a higher definition picture within a 250 nautical mile circle of your current location. And if you combine them, then it will show the two. It'll have a shaded ring around your airplane for 250 nautical miles to indicate the regional coverage, and then anything outside of that ring is going to be ConUS coverage. If you have an integrated storm scope, you can activate or deactivate that from here, and then also clear the strikes off of the map. And then you can also enable traffic overlays on the map, which I do leave on. This is super handy information to have if you're a VFR flyer. We can move on to the map setup screen, which allows you to heavily customize the map based off of exactly what data you want present at the moment. I leave most of these settings in their default configuration, but I do modify a couple of them. The first setting that I modify is I enable TFR overlays. So that's here in the aviation screen, and I just turn that on. This shouldn't be your primary source for TFRs, but it does capture most of them and puts a visual yellow circle over the map to make sure you don't bust any temporary flight restrictions. The other one that I like to modify is I select my weather source, and I change that to FISB because I don't have a SiriusXM or a Connext subscription. However, if you do have one of those subscriptions, you can change the data that the map overlays use here. Just note that you have different weather overlays available to you dependent on what data source you have selected, so you may lose some functionality if you switch away from FISB and go to Connext, for example. Backing out of the map setup screen, you see this slider on the right-hand side. This will allow you to very quickly increase or decrease the amount of detail that's available on the map. So, however, I typically leave it on the most detailed setting. If you're flying over a city or a busy IFR airspace and you need to reduce some detail, you can do that here. You can modify these 4 fields that pop up on the corners of the map screen. I do leave them most of the time in their default configuration. However, sometimes I will change this distance waypoint to the distance and bearing from your destination airport. It's especially handy for non-towered airports. So you can see you're at 12.9 nautical miles west of Buffalo Municipal. So it's really, really handy for making those radio calls. It eliminates the guesswork of how far you are away relative to the airport. So with that out of the way, let's move on to talk about the traffic screen. So if you have ADS-B in enabled on this unit, you should have access to ADS-B traffic, which is a super handy safety feature of the GTN 650. So zooming in and out operates very similar to the map. You can either pinch and drag with your fingers, or you can push the buttons to zoom in and out. If you have a target that you want to learn more information about, just tap on that target. And if available, it will tell you their tail number, the aircraft type, your closure rate, the track to that target, and their ground speed. If you have 2 targets that are close to each other, you can toggle between the 2 with the next button right here. The traffic menu has some options that you can toggle on and off. You can enable or disable TCAS. I always leave this turned on with one exception, and that's when I'm flying the Fisk arrival into Oshkosh, because everybody is so close to each other and it's a madhouse. You'll get traffic warnings left and right, and it gets very distracting. So that's the only time I disable TCAS. You can also down here adjust your vectors. So you can either do an absolute or a relative vector. So essentially an absolute vector will show the trend in the direction that the aircraft is headed on the map. Whereas if you change that to a relative vector, it will factor in your current location and heading. It gets a little confusing though, so I typically just leave it on absolute and look at it on the map. I might note that a relative vector is indicated by a green vector and an absolute vector is white. You can also adjust your vector duration from 30 seconds up to 5 minutes. However, keep in mind that the longer your vector gets, the less accurate it is because it assumes the current airspeed and heading of the target aircraft. My recommendation is to keep it on a short vector. I typically stick within 30 seconds or 1 minute. You can adjust the altitude filter for the traffic screen here as well. So a normal filter is going to show traffic 2,700 feet above and 2,700 feet below you. Above is going to show traffic 9,900 feet above you and 2,700 feet below you. Below is going to show traffic 2,700 feet above you and 9,900 feet below you. And unrestricted is going to show you all targets. For most of us flying single engine piston aircraft, normal should be sufficient. However, if you have something that climbs like a rocket ship, you may want to switch it to above when you're on climb out so you can see people you may be climbing into. Or you could leave it on unrestricted. However, I will say when you start getting all the airliners on your screen, you know, you're cruising at 5,000, you've got people flying over you at 40,000. That's not pertinent information, but it does make the screen a lot busier. I leave this on normal, but it's up to personal preference and aircraft type ultimately. So let's move on to talk about terrain. So earlier we had the terrain map overlay, which would display very similar data on the map overlay, but if you want to avoid putting that much detail on your regular navigation map, you can come here and view more detailed information. Essentially what the terrain screen does is it changes the color or the shading of the ground and obstacles based off of your relative altitude and location to that obstacle. So you can see everything is black, so it shows that we're in the clear, but as I decrease our altitude, you can see that obstacles and the ground starts to change. It goes from black to yellow to red based off of the threat level per se of your clearance. So you do have two scales that you operate on, and you can enable or disable the legend from the map menu. So your terrain shading for the ground clearance is anything greater than 1,000 feet is black. Anything with 1,000 feet to 100 feet of clearance is shaded yellow, and anything less than 100 foot of elevation clearance is shaded red. Now for obstacles, that operates on a slightly different scale. So if they don't show up on the map, you have greater than 2,000 feet of clearance. If the obstacle is white, you have between 2,000 and 1,000 feet of clearance. If it is yellow, you have between 1,000 and 100 feet of clearance. And if it's red, like this one down here, you have less than 100 feet of clearance. Zooming in and out of the terrain map operates very similarly to the map. So you can either pinch and drag, or you can use the buttons on the bottom right-hand side. And then you can modify some of the settings from the menu as well. So you can view a 360-degree view like we have enabled here, or if you want to switch it to an arc, which shows just terrain in front of you, you can do that as well. If you want to overlay your current flight plan, you can enable and disable that there. So now you can see our magenta line overlaid on the terrain map. And if you want to enable or disable the legend, you can do that as well. So you can only view either terrain or obstacle clearance at once, or you can just turn it off, which I prefer to make the screen just a little bit cleaner. And then for some reason, if you want to disable the terrain warning system, you can hit TAWS inhibit here, and it will not give you any terrain warnings. So let's move on from the terrain screen to talk about weather. Now, depending on what inputs you have into your GPS will depict on what of these windows are available. So don't freak out if you don't have all of these windows available. You'll probably only have one or two. If you have a SiriusXM subscription, you can view your SiriusXM weather from here. So you can enable or disable all sorts of different overlays. And you can put a lot of information on this map. Just be careful. It likes to get really busy in a hurry, so I only like to have 2 or 3 things turned on at once. You can also adjust the map orientation and then view the legend. So depending on what overlays you have, the legend will be available here. You can do the same thing for FSB weather, which will be where probably most of us spend our time. You can quickly adjust your next rad coverage by toggling the button in the bottom right hand side of the screen, and then you can enable or disable the different overlays and your map orientation from here as well. If you have a Connext subscription, this operates in the exact same function as XM and FSB weather, so you can enable and disable your overlays and modify your Connext settings here. If you have a storm scope integrated with this unit, you can view that screen here. This is kind of the more traditional storm scope screen that we are used to. You can clear the strikes here and change some of the settings in the menu. From weather, we can move on to the default nav page, which I find really, really handy. I actually probably use this screen more than I do the map when I'm just doing my regular flying. especially if I'm doing my hand flying and not using the autopilot. So you can view your distance, desired track, bearing, and track. And desired track and track is super handy if you're hand flying because you essentially just want those two numbers to be the same. You can also view your ground speed and your ETE here as well. And might I say, these fields are completely customizable. So if you don't like the default, just change it. Configure user fields, choose what you want, go crazy. You can also view where you're at in your flight plan. So if you had a pretty complex sequence, like if you're shooting an approach or something, it will show the previous waypoint, the active waypoint, and the next waypoint. And then you also have this bar down here, which helps you stay on your course a little bit better. You can press the CDI button here to toggle whether you're going to navigate based off of GPS or nav data. So essentially, if you're shooting a GPS approach, leave that on GPS. If you want to tune into a VOR or an ILS, you'll change that to VLOC, and then it will be going off of your active nav frequency. If you want to enable or disable OBS mode, you can do that here and select your course. However, this is probably obsolete because most people used it to extend runway center lines from a waypoint, and now that is built into the unit. But it's still there if you want it. And then you have a quick shortcut button to the map from here as well. And remember, you can also get to this default nav screen by pushing and holding the home button. So it's got some nice shortcuts built in for quick and easy navigation. So let's move on to talk about the flight plan section of the GTN 650. Now you'll want to start with your starting waypoint, your starting location. So here I will import Bolivar. And then say you want to go to Jefferson City, I can go ahead and put KJEF in there. So you can see now it's set up to go from Bolivar to Jefferson City. It's a basic flight plan. Looking at our menu, we have a couple of different options that we can do. So if we want to store this flight plan for use later, we can hit store. And now it's visible in the catalog. So you can access the catalog by going from menu, catalog. You can see that it's here. And if you want to activate that flight plan, you can hit activate. If you want to delete this flight plan that you have, you can press delete and hit OK, and it will clear it out and start you with a blank slate. If you want to preview your flight plan on a map, hit preview, and you can see that we have this nice magenta line going from Bolivar to Jefferson City. If you want to customize the fields that populate when you're creating a flight plan, you can change these guys. However, I typically just leave them default because I think desired track and distance is pretty good information to know. If you want to fly a parallel track to that flight plan, so say you want to offset it 3 miles to the right, you can select that information here. And then you can also invert it. So if you want to fly now from Jefferson City back to Bolivar, instead of deleting this flight plan and re-uploading it in the reverse position, just press invert and it'll flip-flop everything. Pressing VNAV will allow you to access the VNAV screen, which is super, super handy. But first we have to configure a flight plan to be VNAV friendly. So normally when I fly a VNAV, I like to insert in a long track waypoint of -3 nautical miles from my destination. So you can see now we have our flight plan from Bolivar to KJEF -3 to Jefferson City. And you can see that this magenta line shows that this leg of the flight plan is active. If you want to preview the entire flight plan, you can see that here. And you can see that our KJEF -3 waypoint is indicated by this orange square. Now, a VNAV is going to require an altitude pre-select. So I like to make this pattern altitude if we want it to automatically descend to pattern altitude. So to figure out what pattern altitude is, I can go to Waypoint Info and get my pattern altitude of my elevation of 549 feet. So we'll fly 1600 foot pattern, and I can put that in here. And then we'll just go ahead and save that so it's cataloged. So now that we have our waypoint -3, our altitude pre-select, and our final destination, we can navigate to the VNAV screen. You can also access this exact same screen through the utilities page, which I'll show you here in a little bit how to access that. If we want to enable our VNAV, we can just hit VNAV enabled, and you can see that it populates this data. Now, it defaults to flying a 3-degree flight path angle. However, I typically like to descend as a function of airspeed. So say if we want to descend at 500 feet per minute, nice cruising descent, you can see it changes that angle, but it also says now that we are 25 minutes away from top of descent. If we go back to our map, we can scroll along, enter panning mode, and you can see that we are navigating to. You have this TOD waypoint here, which indicates when we need to begin our descent. And then you can see we have this orange square showing that we'll be at 1,600 feet by the time we hit that descent if we begin our 500 foot per minute descent at this TOD waypoint. Now, when we reach that point, the vertical speed required and the vertical deviation fields will populate, showing how fast you need to be descending to meet your desired altitude by the waypoint. And then if you're off course, it'll show that here. The cool thing about the VNAV is if you have this unit paired with a GFC 500 or 600 autopilot, it'll automatically begin descending you to that altitude and automatically level you off at pattern altitude when you get there. So it's a pretty cool system. I am going to stop right here, and I'm not going to ride this all the way through, but if you want to see the entire VNAV process and see this in action, view my GTN 650 VNAV video when it's published. I will put it up here, and there will be a link in the description as well. Let's move on from flight planning and talk about procedures. This is where you can view and activate different procedures for different airports. If you're flying in or out of a Class Bravo airport, you can load and activate arrival and departure information. And you can also load and activate approaches from the approach screen as well. So you can see that we have different ILS, RNAV, and visual approach options for Jefferson City. If you want to shoot that approach, choose which approach you want, your transition, and then you can either load it in the flight plan or you can load and activate the approach. You can also preview the approach from here as well. Moving on from procedures, we can move to the nearest page, which will just show you waypoints, identifiers, things like that are closest to you. So if we click on airports, it will show the top 25 closest airports to us within a 250 nautical mile range. If you click on the airport itself, it'll take you to the Waypoint Information screen, which we'll talk about next. But it will also show you your distance to and bearing to that airport, as well as its most precise approach and its longest runway. So you can see that Buffalo is VFR only with its longest runway of 3,200 feet. But if we scroll down and see Springfield, for example, you can see that they have an ILS and an 8,000 foot longest runway. You can also adjust these parameters in the setup screen, which I'll show you closer to the end of this video on how to change these parameters. So if you're flying a jet, it doesn't recommend seaplane bases to you or helicopter airports. So you can click on any of these screens to view the nearest waypoints to you. However, I typically only use airspace or weather frequencies. So if I need to view the closest weather station to me, I can do that. And then just pressing on the frequency will load that into your standby frequency, which is super handy. And you can view the nearest center frequencies from here as well. If we scroll down from the menu, we can view more options and we can move on to the Waypoint Information screen. So this is configured very similarly to the nearest screen. However, you have to select the waypoint that you want. So here we have Buffalo pulled up. If you want to view general information about the airport, you can click on information here. If you want to view any procedures that they have, you can view and load those approaches from here. However, Buffalo only has visual approaches. If you want to view how the runways are oriented, you can click here. It tells you information about the runways. If they have more than one, you could toggle them here on the left. And then you can see that we have pilot controlled lighting on 122.9. And if you click that frequency, it will pull up that frequency in standby. You can preview the airport, which is very similar to the runway preview. And then you can view weather data and NOTAMs for that airport and area if you're connected to a good weather source. You can view frequencies. So you can see they only have one frequency of 122.9 as their multicom. And if you want to load that, you can press it and make it standby here. You can view very similar information for all sorts of different waypoints, as well as user waypoints. So this is where you would go to view your stash of user waypoints, as well as create a waypoint and import them from an SD card. If you want to view more information on the different ways to use user waypoints and create them or import them, I will make a video about importing and creating user waypoints in the GTN 650. When I have it, I will put it up here and in the description as well. You have various services available to you, specifically if you have a Connext or XM subscription. So if you have a Connext subscription and sat phone enabled through Garmin, you can dial numbers here and adjust the volume. You can also send text messages through that sat phone if you have that capability enabled as well. If you have a Sirius XM music subscription through your GPS, you can adjust the station and the volume through here. And if you want to send position reports through the Connext system, you can do that from here as well. However, ADS-B has probably ruled this obsolete by now, just because FlightAware and Flight Radar 24 use the FISB data over satellite-based reporting. But if you want to use that, you can configure it from here. And then you can adjust your phone contacts for your sat phone here as well. Let's move on to talk about some of the different utilities that are built into this unit. Some of these are super, super handy. This is the shortcut to the VNAV screen, like we talked about before. So you should recognize this screen. This is just another way to access it. The trip planning screen is also another super handy one. You have a couple of different ways that you can use this trip planner. You can either import your current location with the P position button. Since we're in flight, this is probably the most accurate way to do it. But if you wanted to change it and say we wanted to view some flight information about a flight from Springfield to Jefferson City, we can manually change those waypoints as well. And you can also import an entire flight plan from here as well. So it's kind of a cool way of doing it. If you want to use your sensor data and import your current ground speed, you can press that here, or you can manually manipulate your ground speed if it's different from if you're on the ground or if it's different from what you're currently cruising. You can change your time and date of your departure if you want. And then once you have all this data programmed, you can hit compute data and it will calculate the distance to desired track, en route safe altitude, ETE, and ETA figures for this flight. And then since we did it for a flight plan, you can view it for the next leg as well. So this is a super handy way to kind of use an electronic E6B that is configured in this unit to make trip planning super, super simple. We can move on to the fuel planning utility, which operates very, very similarly to the trip planning utility. So you can see we can enter our starting waypoint, our ending waypoint, and change our mode. We can use sensor data to import our fuel information and ground speed, or we can manually input it like I did here. And then once you have all the appropriate data in there, just hit compute data. And this will tell us that for a flight from Springfield to Jefferson City, we will need 10.3 gallons. We'll have 46.2 gallons remaining when we get there. We'll have a reserved time of 3 hours and 17 minutes, a range of 545 nautical miles, an efficiency of 9.6 nautical miles per gallon, and we'll have about a 4-hour endurance as we currently stand. If you need to modify this information, you can go back to edit data. The density, altitude, true airspeed, and winds calculation also operates similarly to the ones before, except you need to add your barometric pressure. So say it's standard pressure 2992. We use sensor data to get our track, heading, and ground speed. However, if you want to manipulate these guys, you can do that as well. You need to get your calibrated airspeed, so we'll just say it's 132 knots, just making up a number, but you would calculate that. And then get your outside temperature, say, of 3 degrees Celsius. When you have all these fields calculated, hit compute data, and it'll calculate your density, altitude, true airspeed, wind direction, wind speed, and your head or tailwind component. We can move on to talk about rain prediction, which can be used to estimate GPS coverage at a specific location at a specific date and time. If rain verification is required for the approach that you want to shoot, you can just enter your waypoint, date, and time, compute rain, and it will tell you if it's available or not. From the flight timers page, you can set a timer that starts up or down. And this is probably helpful for if you're doing a holding pattern or something like that. You have access to that information. It's just a super simple timer. If you want to create a scheduled message, you can do that from here. There are 3 different types of messages that you can create. There is an event, which goes off at a specified date and time. There is a one-time message, which goes off after a specific amount of time has elapsed. And then there is a periodic message, which will go off at every interval of your designated time. So a good example of when you would use this would be a reminder to switch tanks every 30 minutes. So scheduled messages can be pretty handy for whatever you want just a simple reminder for. If you have imported a checklist into the GTN 650, you can view and check these off from here. However, most of the time, if I'm going to use a digital checklist, I'm going to do it on my iPad and use my GPS for its core purpose, which is navigation, but it's a nice feature to have. The last two utilities are going to be logs, which is primarily for your avionics installer if you have any issues, and then clean screen mode, which is handy for wiping down the screen if you don't want it to go crazy thinking you're touching it. The last screen that we will talk about is the system screen, which most of this is for your avionics installer and used at the time of installation, but there are a couple of things that I like to modify on here. If you go to the setup, you can change your keyboard layout. So if you don't like how the current keyboard is set up, you have a couple of different options here. You can also change your nearest airport runway parameters, which we talked about earlier. So you can toggle hard, soft, water, give it a minimum length, and then you can choose to include or exclude user airports. And the last thing that I like to talk about is alerts. So if you want to enable an arrival alert based off of when you get a certain distance from your destination, you can do that there. And you can also modify the alerts that you get when you enter an airspace. I like to leave them all on because I'm terrified of busting an airspace, but if they get too busy for you, you can deactivate some of them here. So this wraps up my tutorial on how to use the Garmin GTN 650 for beginners. If you have any questions, you can either message me or leave a comment down below, and I will try to get to it as quickly as possible. I thank you for watching this video till the end. Hope you guys fly safe, and we'll see you in the next video.